you. Now, African countries are grappling with the knock-on effects of the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine, which has prompted a surge in food and fuel prices. As policymakers across the region look for ways to address the spike in cost of living, some countries are now raising their minimum wage to help their citizens keep up with the higher prices. The Kenyan government, for example, says it's raising the minimum wage by 12%. Morocco has announced a similar move with an increase of 16% for public servants and 10% for all other workers. Benin, which has not changed its minimum wage since 2014, will give a 30% increase. This increase is accompanied by an obligation for employers to take out health insurance for their low-income employees as of January 1st, 2023. Well, I'm now joined by Dr. Anthony Francis Mveyange, the Executive Director for Partnership for African Social and Governance Research in Nairobi. Thanks for taking time to talk to us. Are these increments reasonable or even sustainable?
Thank you very much for hosting me today. Well, that's $1 million question, whether these increments are sustainable and whether the governments, actually, African governments, can afford these. I think that it warrants more in-depth analysis and thinking by the governments to understand the ripple effects of these decisions, both from the supply side and the demand side, to understand what are the ramifications to consumers, to employees, because at the end of the day, a portion of Africans, say Kenyans, Moroccans, or Beninese, who are going to benefit from this is quite small because the formal employment is quite minute, so to speak. We need to think about businesses, to what extent these increments in costs are going to affect businesses and what governments are going to do to support businesses.
In your thinking, Dr. Anthony Mveyange, what could this mean in depth in terms of businesses in the short time?
Higher costs of production for businesses, possibly with higher cost, lower profits, and most likely less taxes being released to the governments. So there's sort of a vicious cycle around these decisions. While employees and workers will be very happy, that may not necessarily be the case for businesses across the continent.
In your opinion, then, what would be the ideal solution or move in order to balance things?
One, I think there are multi-pronged policies that the governments can think through. One is, how do they cushion and support businesses to be able to continue to produce and offer services that they are offering, at the same time being able to continue to employ the workers at the slightly higher labor costs? That's number one. But number two is, what are the medium-term to longer-term policy ramifications to create an enabling environment for not only businesses to thrive, but to regulate the prices, for example. Inflation is still very high. 12% increase, is it sustainable enough to cushion even employees themselves to be able to afford, for example, the higher prices that actually we see going around the countries in the continent? So there's a need for governments also to think about how do they manage the broader macroeconomy such that it becomes sustainable for the local common mwananchi.
Just very quickly, the International Monetary Fund suggested cash transfers for households in Africa. Is this feasible, do you think?
Well, theoretically, yes. Well, there are some programs that have been done. The problem with cash transfer is implementation. How sustainable can we do those? How can you massively roll out cash transfers across many households that are going to be vulnerable because of the shocks, because of the price increases that we see? It is easier to be done across a segment or cohort of particular populations, but doing it across the board, we have seen some evidence, not only conflicting evidence on this cash transfer, but abilities of governments to implement fully to reach those who are most vulnerable has been quite challenging. And we understand those evidence already exist on those fronts. So I think yes, they can mediate in the medium term, maybe in the short to medium term, especially for those who are the very most vulnerable, the elderly, for example. But if you look at the bigger spectrum of household, those who are in the informal sector, I think it warrants more thinking, more strategic planning for the medium term and longer term.
All right, Dr. Anthony Francis Mveyange, thank you very much for speaking to us here in Focus on Africa. Thank you.